What I would recommend doing is, and some of this comes from eco-grief work with people who are just starting what Linda Bazell and Sarah Edwards call the waking up syndrome, where you suddenly realize, sometimes with a shock, that things are really the way they are. And then what do you do with all the feelings that come up and the panic and everything else? So when people are in that stage, the first thing is to get support, because there's something to be said for individual practices of various kinds, mindfulness practices, somatic practices, and that all helps. But they were created for a time that wasn't facing the end of life, basically, on Earth. So this is a new situation for our species, even though we've been through tough times before. So we need support. We can't do this alone. So to seek out like-minded people who also get the same information and really understand what's happening is absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen is that, even when people start out in panic or helplessness or rage, if they have other people who are supportive to talk to about it, they move through that pretty quickly. And they finally land at the question that's all important is, now what? So the second thing I would recommend is get busy. It's the age-old crisis advice, right? If you're freaking out, do something.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In these times of the great disconnection, humanity's disconnection from the earth itself, how can we find a way to reconnect in any significant way? Professor and thought leader in eco-psychology and ecotherapy and applied mythology and so much more, Craig Chalquist can tell us a bit about that reconnection. All right, welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And once again, this is yet another interview in a recent series that is very, very engaging for me. This is someone that has made a big impact on me as I've been doing the research that has blended my love of life and love of nature and more or less a mytho-poetic leaning in a study of psychology and personal development for a long time. And today's guest is a remarkable. I know Craig Chalquist as an author because I've only known you, Craig, through your books, and not very many of them. As I started to do some research about you, I realized, oh my gosh, this is a prolific author, and I have only read a couple, and particularly the one that I'm most anchored to in my experience of your perspective on the world is the edited compilation that you put together with Linda Bazell, Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature. Excuse me, Healing with Nature in Mind. And I've got to say that when I first looked at reaching out to connect with you, we didn't have the coronavirus going on.
Yeah. We
had already the serious layer upon layer of the predicaments that we have created for ourselves. The predicaments of the now ecocidal impact of the human operating system on Earth and human systems. And that was going to be plenty. That was going to be a conversation with plenty of depth. And I knew that you have walked so many of the paths, not only of telling the truth about what's actually going on, but also, and far more importantly, you've been exploring just a desperately needed aspect of what it is to heal ourselves, to bring ourselves to a psychological and a psychospiritual wholeness in life is the way I would say it. And I'm hoping you're going to fill in gaps that I leave here. But I just wanted to introduce folks to my experience of you, and now we've just in the time we've been exchanging emails to formalize this meeting, the world has changed. The
Yeah.
world has changed in a way that I absolutely could never have predicted. Although I have known deep in my bones since I was a child that I would in my lifetime experience nothing short of devastating and horrific outcomes in terms of our impact on the planet. But it's interesting. You and I were just talking before I hit the record button that there's an interaction going on here, and the interaction is, I believe, what you've been pointing to in your important work, your writings and your practices with people, that we have been so immersed in the myth of human supremacy, as Derek Jensen might want to call it, that we consider it the virus something to war against, because how dare it threaten that which is sacrosanct, which is, the business as usual human operating system. And it is indeed changing us in a way that, unfortunately, even with the beautiful expression and powerful expression of people like Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and a number of other activist organizations and important voices, I hate to say it, and I don't mean to be cynical in this conversation, but I think all of those voices, as beautiful as they've been, have now been just mashed into the maw of normalization of our cruelty and our disconnection. And so I just want to point to, we were talking a little bit before started to record, and you mentioned a couple things that seem to point toward there's a very different framing, maybe a couple of different framings that would be very wholesome, very important to possibly replace if we could, but at least to mention, because they don't get airtime in a war-framed environment in which we are separate from ourselves and attacking war style this virus. So enough of this long-winded introduction. I really so looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for taking time out, and especially at this remarkable and deeply changed time. Craig Chalquist, thank you so much for being here. I didn't read from your bio, but I did ask if you would introduce yourself. Do you mind just starting from zero instead of me reading something from a website? And just let us know, how did you land at that foundation point in your life where you knew you had something to say, you had something to write, you had something to explore that might connect us with a psychospiritual core for ourselves as individuals, and also possibly reconnect us with each other and with the earth in a deeper way. So again, welcome, and start wherever you will.
Thank you so much for that and for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. It's important, particularly these days, as we were talking about off camera a couple of minutes ago. So for me, there were two big points of departure as I look back. And one of them was just childhood and being outside a lot. Excuse me. I grew up in a house where there was domestic violence. And one of the things that I did to look after myself was get outside a lot. I spent a lot of time at friends' houses and things like that. And I remember there was a particular tree that I would climb up in when I got really scared. And that tree's no longer standing, but I remember it clearly. and other places in the neighborhood. I grew up in an olive orchard that was being pounded into a subdivision. So part of what I experienced was how that place held me, what was left of the nature of that place held me, but also the grief of seeing it asphalted over. So by the time I went to college, it was basically gone except for some trees.
May I ask where that was, Craig?
That was El Cajon, California.
El Cajon. Yeah, I spent a decent part of my growing up in Mission Hills.
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
And
Okay.
my stepbrother and sisters lived in El Cajon.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
It's changed
Please.
a lot, but it's actually interesting the evolution that place is going through. from trashy white supremacist haven into something much more multicultural, especially with the Iraqi presence there now, just uplifting the culture of the whole place, you know. It's great to visit there. So that was one factor. And I've talked to other people who say that oftentimes when you're sensitized to the connection between nature and what we like to think of as the inner world, there was often something in childhood that made that happen. So for me, that was one of the things. And then later it was being a doctoral student of psychology. After having been a psychotherapist on and off for 9 years, I decided to get a PhD. And then during that process, I was living in San Diego, which is where I was born. And I kept having really intense dreams about the place. And the dreams didn't fit the dream theory or practice that I had been trained to do for so many years and that I had done with myself and with my clients. So, you know, a presence would show up in my dreams that I gradually realized was San Diego itself. And it would indicate, you know, this part of me is suffering this decline, or that part of me has been ecologically injured. And these were areas of the city that I was unfamiliar with. So I would actually go out and look and see that that was damage that had been done.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very confused by this. I didn't grow up in a worldview that understood those deep connections between people and places. And so I got help when I was a graduate student from a number of people who studied something called eco-psychology, which basically marries the best of deep psychology and psychotherapy with environmental and ecological thought. So that was a helpful path forward for me as well. And then I guess the third thing I would mention is once I started writing a little bit and getting the word out about how important these deep connections are and how they influence our moods, not only our dreams, but our sense of health and who we are in the world and things like that. I made the acquaintance of Linda Bazell, who was, at that time, I was then living in Santa Barbara County, and she lives in Santa Barbara. And she was doing some talks at the local city college on eco-psychology. So we got to know each other. And she said, "Do you know what ecotherapy is?" And I went, "No, I haven't heard of it." And she said, "Well, it's kind of applying eco-psychology. It's actually reconnecting with nature, plants and animals and landscapes and things like that." And she said, "Wouldn't it be great to have an anthology on that?" So that's where that came from.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's a good first step. Could I ask just for a moment, right around that time, and perhaps it's the time when you chose to go get a PhD, there was something calling you to deepen your experience, is my guess. I'm sorry to be presumptuous, but that's just what it sounded like.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you could share what that voice or that compelling influence was inside of you.
Yeah. You know, in my years in school, we were always trained to look at dreams as aspects of ourself. And then as a graduate student, when I began studying, actually I'd been studying Jung's work, Carl Jung's work, since I was an undergrad, but really getting into it deeply and applying the ideas, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings in the whole world of archetypes, you know, supposedly universal themes that show up all over the place. And you know, how that links us to the more than human in our dreams and our art, in our fantasy, things like that. So there was that deepening, but I realized that working with dreams that way wasn't helping me understand what was happening with Earth and place. And so those dreams I mentioned before about San Diego, those were the big event that really brought me into this. I actually had a dream. I mentioned it in some of my parapsychology writings. Parapsychology is my own version of mine and other people of ecopsych. And I mentioned one dream in particular where a feminine figure showed up and had a familiar presence, and I felt like I knew her from somewhere. And she finally just came out right out and said, "I'm San Diego." And I had no framework for understanding that. So my doctoral work was about trying to put something together, which became parapsychology.
Yeah.
But the intimacy of that interaction, you know, how I could be so deeply affected in my moods, in my relationships, things like that, by the presence of a place. And I didn't grow up in an animistic worldview. I didn't think that there were some sort of maybe mystical energies between me and the place. I didn't have any of that vocabulary. My mom was a scientist, so I had to learn a lot. And also, one of my fieldwork advisors said I should talk to Native Californians and other people who preserve that indigenous sense of places and landscapes and other beings as alive and animate. So I did a bit of that too. Probably not as much as I should have at the time, but
Got it.
some of this was stumbling my way toward a framework that I could actually use.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I appreciate you taking us along this path, this recap of the influences on you and major kind of signposts along the way. And I'd like to just share a little bit to just kind of keep up with you and share a bit. And that is, I also grew up in San Diego in my formative years, and spent a lot of time in the desert, a lot of time in Baja,
Yeah.
and a lot of time in the ocean. And I both had my own personal practices quite early on in some shamanic and energetic lineages, and then also went on to become involved with the training business. And that ranged from working with corporate executives one week to training adults to work with at-risk youth in cities around the world the next. And then very personal, intimate training with couples for instance, in areas of intimacy and communication and so on. And what I've come to notice years later is that the business part, the linear business kind of the core curriculum that's expected around particularly corporate training has come to be completely flat and hollow. Actually, just obviously a cornerstone in the destructive part of business as usual. What has not only stayed the test of time, but has actually grown in significance in my experience from the different lineages that I've been a part of, are the ones that are considerably outside of the normal business as usual mainstream, whether that's about counseling or psychology, whether that's about personal psychospiritual practices, the further from the center line that any of my practices have been, or lineages that I've been connected with are, the more they seem to be coming to the fore in these, the most important times in human history.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if if that's validated in your experience as well, because it sounds like you deliberately took yourself off an off ramp, if you will, and found the resonant track for you, and you evidently found some powerful allies as well. So would you say a little bit about how it's been to be on that alternative track? Perhaps any ups and downs, but particularly how's that showing up now in terms of importance?
Yeah, I keep thinking of a comment that Gloria Steinem made at one point where she said something like, "Of course I'm at the margins. Who would want to be anywhere else?"
I love it.
I love that. One of the things I noticed being a student of history, if by no means an expert in it, but I've read it for years, and whenever we seem to move forward into more maturity, as collectively speaking, more richness of experience, more spirituality in many ways, it doesn't seem like it's because somebody took up maybe a missionary position with regard to the collective. It seems to be the other way around, where there's a group like the women's movement, for instance, that holds the margin, and they stay out there. They stay radical. And by doing that, they drag the entire culture in their direction, And I think a limited version of that happens in paradigm shifts, the ones that Kuhn was talking about in his book, where, an outsider like Einstein comes along who hadn't even really published very much and has these radical ideas that he won't let go of. And then gradually physics starts to move in his direction as more and more people say, wow, this really makes sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was pretty evident to me, I think, even as an undergrad, before any of this became conscious, that the really exciting stuff always happened at the edge. And then when I studied permaculture, and it put so much emphasis on the growth and diversity of edge places, which I think is a cultural piece too. That was an influence. Hearing, growing up watching a lot of Star Trek, and then hearing Gene Roddenberry and now especially his son, Rod Roddenberry, talk about diversity as something that is, in philosophical terms, it's ontological. It's, it's the basis of being in many ways, whether ecological at the edge places or culturally at the edge places or whatever, So all of those things influence me. So I also had a number of teachers in grad school who, they were not in any means anti-science, but they were anti-scientism. They were against the idea that any single body of knowledge and practice was the best way to know reality, which of course was familiar to me from my Christian upbringing. I was raised in a rather, maybe 2 steps away from fundamentalist Lutheranism, and hearing everybody go on about all that until it made me sick, and I just moved beyond it. So this totalitarian idea that there's only one form of knowledge and practice, was something that I was allergic to by the time I got to college, I think. So I've always been really interested in scientific discovery, and I try to keep up on it in different ways as best I can. But the idea that we can only learn things by measuring them, for instance, I abandoned that idea years ago and never looked back.
Right.
So when I'm lucky enough too, where I teach in places like the California Institute of Integral Studies, where a lot of us are familiar with how all this works, and we look at the big issues in terms of worldviews, the mechanistic worldview that is now destroying the planet and creating things like coronavirus. As Sonia Shaw points out in her book on epidemics, it's not the virus's fault, it's ours. We're the ones invading animals' territory. It's not, it's not the virus that's the invader, we are. It's mirroring us, So looking at it in terms of what would be an alternative worldview that's more participatory and diverse and ecological is something that's been helpful for me. And trying to move in that direction as best I can.
Yeah, thanks. So again, I just have these little pocket questions that really come out of my recent experience that I'm so curious to run by you to see how it how it shows up for you if it does. And one of the most important for me is I have this interesting blend of experiences in these times. Again, I hold this as the most predicament-filled and important time in human history, period, bar none. Just here we are. And I'm daily up to my earlobes in the what I call the sober data, the headlines of how screwed we are in one dimension or another, and blah blah blah. And I also still have a very strong connection with my practices that come from my early teens and all the way through life that have consistently held a note that is out, as you were just describing, outside of the normal framing, the normal business as usual experience for the average person. And that started with one of the boldest lessons that I got early on was there is nothing salvageable about human society. There's nothing, not one thing. And for my, roughly 16-year-old self, that was jaw-dropping to hear that assertion from a mentor. And it was not shoved down my throat. It was just that's what was real for them, and they said it quite boldly and easily, and it's like matter-of-factly, which has actually proven itself out in spades for now many years since I was 16. So what I'm getting at is I have a pretty fluid and multifaceted experience each day in terms of what just normally emerges and bubbles up as a matter of what I hope is just a wholesome human feeling as a normal reaction. Normal's probably not a good word because what's been normalized in our culture is a whole different thing. So to the question is, are you experiencing a broader and deeper range of feelings that are authentically welling up in response to where we are and what's occurring? For me, I have had to learn to let go at levels that I could never have dreamt of when I was 16. Hell, I couldn't have imagined this level a year ago.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm asking, how have you been changed or moved in a particular way in recent times that have perhaps surprised you or just notably impacted you?
Yeah. For me, it's been a weird emotional mix because on the one hand, do you remember those nuclear bomb drills that we had to go through when we were in elementary school, right?
Yeah.
So the whole thing, all the propaganda about the Russians are the evil empire and all that, So we were looking for the end of the world at every turn, and then all of a sudden it didn't happen. So, I'm used to growing up with that kind of apocalyptic background emotionally in some ways. And then on the other hand, it was duplicated at home, growing up in a violent home. And there were plenty of times when I didn't think I'd survive into adulthood. So one of the things I'm bringing to the whole discussion about how bad things are, because anybody who watches the news ought to be really scared, My colleagues, his name just popped out of my head, Stephen Harding. He's an ecologist. He often says, if you're not upset by everything that's happening, climate change and all the rest of the things that are going wrong, you need to be in therapy to figure out why you're not upset, And I think he's right. So part of it, there's a piece that's familiar, and then there's a piece that's unfamiliar. And it involves my own personal immersion, which we go through this, I think, a couple of times in a life, perhaps, but immersion in what Carl Jung would have called the archetype of the night sea journey, which the past 3 years were for me, including the death of both my dad, the father who raised me, and my birth father. They both died the same year. In the case of my dad, he died after a long bout of dementia, and he died in a lot of pain. So I got to see that up close. At the same time, I was having a lot of dreams about what Shakespeare would have referred to as, in that one line, I forget which play, where he says, "For God's sake, shall we sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings?" And so seeing a place where I was working, which isn't the current place that I'm working, seeing men running things badly there, and then seeing what a mess they're making of the government here in the States, and then the death of two fathers. And so this whole image of the old, alchemical image of the old king dying so that something new can be born, has been with me a lot for the last 3 years, both on the personal level and then in terms of my reaction to the collective. So on the one hand, there's, I can get behind some of the things that are falling apart and going away because they've needed to for a long time. And yet I think we're a little less than human if we don't have some sort of an emotional response of being upset and sorrowful and even angry. Because when these things collapse, when these big structures collapse, people get hurt. And so as much as I can think of the coronavirus right now, for instance, as some kind of ecological corrective, I also see that lots of people are out of jobs right now. There are people that are dying right now in hospitals. My mom is in a post-acute care center right now recovering from a hip injury. And if that virus gets in there, that's going to kill a lot of people. So yeah, there's a lot to be worried about as we go through these transitions. It's a real underworld descent.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an idealized, let's just take a trip to the underworld and come out happier. This is a real plunge.
Yeah.
So I think people need to face up to that, because if we don't make the plunge happen internally and really let it work on us, then it gets externalized as turning the upper world into the underworld, so to speak, which our fossil fuel industries are doing a nice job of right now. So very much an apocalyptic time in a psychological sense.
Yeah. You just mentioned something, you called it the plunge, and of course that descent. And those words plant me firmly looking at a framing of this as an initiation, a collective initiation or rite of passage. Is that what you're leaning toward?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Could you say more about how you see that?
I've been really impressed by how in cultures all over the world, when people go into some sort of initiation procedure to become fully human and fully adult, initiation hurts. It's not just an informal or even a formalized little ritual that gets set up and interesting things are said and done, and then you're an adult. In many cultures, particularly the indigenous ones, you have to really suffer in order to become an adult. And part of it is learning how to deal with all the feelings that brings up, and anger and rage and sadness and things like that, so that you are a psychological adult. And so I think to some extent that's playing out on the world stage. And the thing about initiations is you can put them off, but every time you do, they get harder. So as I think it was Joseph Campbell and Jung both that pointed this out, that when the call comes to a deeper kind of living, and then you're not ready for it for one reason or another, and you kind of put it to one side, it'll leave you alone for a little while. But then the next time the call comes, it's louder. And it gets louder the next time. So this virus stuff, I mean, we've been dealing with this for a long time. The ecological conditions that we've imposed on ourselves create, a fertile ground for this. Mm-hmm. We've been messing up nature in other ways, and that's been a discussion since, I was going to say the 1950s, but it's in Jung's Red Book, which was he started working on it in 1913, I think, 1914. Right. And there's ecological issues in that book. So this is an old discussion, and now the voices are getting louder as the debt comes due. The collectors from the natural world are pounding on our door really loudly right now.
Yeah.
So as part of this initiation on a collective scale, we need to look at which structures to let go of and how to modify the ones that we might keep so that we can realign ourselves with nature. Because as Gary Snyder pointed out, nature bats last.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. I'm curious. This is another one of those pocket questions that I've got in my own experience. I've been looking long and hard since about 7 years ago. I became aware of not just climate change, but abrupt climate change framing of what's going on in that particular dimension. And I immediately knew that I had to vet the information. I had to learn how to learn enough about climate change to be able to vet that this was the real deal or not. Because either this was the craziest bullshit to come down the pike, or it's the transformation of humanity, whether we're ready for it or not.
Yep.
I confirmed to my own satisfaction the latter, and I almost immediately had to move beyond the climate change conversation, strictly because of the deep lies and toxicity involved with not only direct denial, but the far more voluminous willful ignorance that the rest of the world was putting on, and has coyly been off on the side just doing life for 40 years, hearing the reports and not doing a damn thing either. So denial or willful ignorance, take your pick. What I shifted my attention to as I was again researching and writing my own book, which I ended up calling the Impossible Conversation, and I put that out in 2017. I discovered that there were handfuls of other measures of our ecocidal impact on the planet that truthfully showed up as being far more urgent and immediate and completely inarguable, far more so than anything in the climate change conversation. So what I was left with was, this is the impossible conversation, because what's at its core is, we will not, I knew enough from doing corporate training for 30 years that we will not voluntarily slow this thing down, not to mention shutting any part of it down. Interestingly enough, here we are.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if you can plow through not only a long question, but also some of the cynicism that came up with the name, The Impossible Conversation. I'm curious how that rings for you. How impossible has it been? How impossible is it now? Is there any possibility showing up in this coronavirus pause?
I have a lot of faith in the ability of people to do constructive things when all other possibilities have been exhausted. And, and I see a lot of that. I think we've all seen those beautiful images of people in Italy singing to each other.
Yeah.
And then people in Marin are howling to each other to support healthcare workers. It's funny, if you look at a map of Marin, it could just be my fancy, but it seems like there are not one, but two coyote shapes in Marin if you turn it different ways on a map, and there's a lot of coyote stuff happening up there. So I was delighted to see that article for that reason too. But one of the positive things about big structures that break down, for instance, healthcare structures in this country that are so bad that other countries like Norway are warning people, don't go to the US right now because they don't have even remotely adequate ways of taking care of people's health, you know?
Right.
So those kinds of things give the rest of us perspective, particularly people that don't do the diligence that you did and really follow up the arguments and the data and the facts and talk to people and write about it. You know, people who are more in denial or willed ignorance, this is an opportunity for them to say, you know what? Only the rich and famous get tested right now, and you might have this, right? You have a fever, you're coughing and all that, you might have this. And so that gets people thinking, and it gets them angry in a good way, I think, because this system that they've been comfortable with isn't comfortable anymore.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not serving them. So new discussions become possible, I think, when something like this happens.
Yeah.
As far as the bigger picture of where the whole thing is headed, you know, there's been comparisons that some people have drawn between us and ancient Rome before the Western Empire fell.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, though, a lot more will fall than just our empire. Industrial civilization itself is at risk to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really big fall. Like you, I tend to think that we won't stop in time. So I'm directing more of my energy toward how can we foster individually, you know, personally, but also at the community level, more eco-resilience, more access to spiritual resources, psychological resources, because I'm looking ahead at a time when a lot of this will fall down. And then people have to kind of do the best they can on their own, which they're actually doing right now. The US government is not helping a lot of people right now. And they're sending people $1,500 checks for what? I mean, you're going to get thrown out of your house, and $1,500 isn't going to do anything. It won't even buy groceries for a month, you know?
Yeah.
It's just a bribe, you know, it's just to make them look like they're doing something. So I'm focusing on fostering small pockets of community that will hold out because they're grounded in practices and principles that are resilient.
Mm-hmm.
So that's fascinating to me. It gets more interesting as time goes on and I work with more and more people. So that's, these days I'm trying to do a lot of networking and to bring people together.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. That's very similar to the track that I think you've taken a look at my website. That's a lot of what I end up working on as really the core of that book I mentioned, and then the core of the body of work itself is to provide support and resources for people who are seeing the world as in collapse now. And at the center of that is reconnection.
Yeah.
You know, because clearly what got us into this predicament is that we've disconnected from all the primary sources of meaning in a human life.
Yeah.
Deeper self, each other, earth, and soul. And that's, again, what drew me to ecotherapy, not only your book, but the whole notion of ecotherapy is that obvious reconnection with earth. And then clearly you can't have those things going on without soul.
Yeah.
So it just really sucked me in that way. I guess I'm curious, can you say more about either projects that you've seen or you're involved with, or anything that you're aware of around the world that does give you some inspiration that you're seeing, and it fills you with a sense of the goodness of humanity and a new possibility?
Yeah. I actually collect those kinds of stories. And the ones that interest me the most are the ones that don't feel like whistling past the graveyard, but instead, or, you know, positive thinking, which I think is just denial these days.
Yeah.
But the ones that actually come out of situations of some kind of rupture, whether it's an issue of social justice or environmental justice or what have you, and, you know, some rupture where people step up and they become more than themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I forget her name off the top of my head. There's a woman in the Gaza Strip who posts photographs to Instagram think of her name in a minute. She is aware that the world is aware, although probably not sufficiently, that the whole place is a war zone and has been for a long time, that the people there are oppressed. But what she's chosen to do is to say, okay, that's a given, but I'm going to post pictures. Nassar Khalud, I think is her name. I'm going to post pictures of how we're holding together. So she'll put a picture of her bicycle leaning against a tree that's blossoming, or she'll post a picture of friends of hers that are meeting for a communal meal and things like that. And it sends the message, in spite of everything, we're holding it together here. Mm-hmm. In spite of the oppression and the war and everything else, you know.
Yeah.
There are examples. I'm thinking of, there's a group called Incredible Edible that started out with some women in a small village in England who said, what would happen if we started growing vegetables in our front yard instead of our backyard? And what if we created a club that only had one rule? If you're hungry and you eat, you're in. So now this thing has gone international and they're feeding everybody, you know. So there's things like that that happen all the time. One of my favorite examples is Jacqueline Susskind, who saved a stand of redwoods by writing a poem and getting to know the guy who was the executive of the logging company that was getting ready to cut it down. And so without, without lots of protesting and things like that we're used to seeing, she did it through networking and relationships. Mm-hmm. So there's a term that some of us have been using for the past 4 years or so called enchantivism. And it's not meant to replace activism. If anything, we need more activism. But it's meant to be an alternative for people who are either burned out activists and don't want to do it anymore, or those of us who never felt called to be activists. Mm-hmm. And at the center of it are these kinds of stories where people are rallying and showing the greatness of the human spirit and the greatness of compassion, and refusing to be beaten down by social forces that are telling everybody that, business as usual and it's all about profit and all that stuff, you know.
Right.
So enchantivism is my way of pulling these stories together and saying, we're better than this.
Yeah.
So,
well, Craig, I'm gonna be putting your website information in the show notes for this interview. And what I remember, it was so easy to get to that enchantivism segment. The tab on your website's right there on the front, and I was really drawn to it. I'm so glad you're reminding me to spend some time on this topic. I didn't look long and hard. I just went into there enough to get whet my appetite. I'm curious, are there books or videos or any way in which this has come to life in that way yet? Are there any of those things coming? Because this sounds like something that really wants to be shared, because this is the kind of stuff that anyone who's half awake needs and wants an infusion of this kind of, not hopium that I think you were talking about, not being interested in the, fake positive thinking, but where people are actually finding a piece of their core in expression of something larger than themselves. Do you have any kind of expression coming on like that?
We're getting there. We have, right now we've got a Facebook group for enchantivism, and people can apply to get in. There's like 500 or 600 people in there right now. We did a certificate at Pacifica Graduate Institute on enchantivism. I've been thinking about getting that going again when I have a chance to. So actually teaching people how to do this, that's something that's happening. And then I'm going to start doing a series of webinars that I'll be posting. I have a Facebook public page, as well as a LinkedIn page. And so I'm doing a free, the first one's free, and there will be free ones as I go. Also some paid ones on similar topics. So on the 18th of April at 6 p.m. Pacific time, I'm going to be doing a free webinar called Welcome to Hell, and spelled H-E-L, as in the Norse goddess. And it's about what wisdom folklore can tell us and have us make use of during times like this, times of illness in the collective body, you know. So there's that too. And I always try to end on a hopeful note, in the sense of active hope that Joanna Macy talks about, rather than the passive stuff that we were talking about.
Right.
Because it's up to us. If there's one message I hope people get these days, is that this is your thing. This is your show, right? It's not, the politicians aren't going to fix it. The clergy isn't going to fix it. The business people aren't going to fix it.
Yeah.
We have to fix it, or it won't get fixed. So.
Yeah. Craig, I got a weird question for you. It happens to bubble up because of something you just said. And early on in my research for the book, and to just find out what's being done out there at the leading edge. What does the leading edge look like in terms of any kind of personal development work that would reconnect people with those primary sources of meaning again? Again, deeper self, others, earth, soul. And I found some good providers for self-regulation practices that were, just so darn useful. They're so basic but important as a foundation. They weren't quite that depth of reconnection, but they were a good start.
Yeah.
And then when I went that next step after that, I found a guy named Bob Doppelt and his book, Transformational Resilience. And I was really turned on by it, because the word resilience, like everything else that we consume in our society, it becomes normalized to, if we get knocked down, well, then we pick ourselves back up and we get ourselves back into the business as usual track again. That's called resilience if we don't watch out. That's going to be the default. What I was amazed by was that Bob had found, in his own experience, a need to describe something other than that, something beyond that, something that implied our ability to choose a track larger than ourselves, or larger than the usual normalized track of reality. And so, and I'm sorry if you may be very familiar with this work, but just to say it for folks who are watching who might not know, more or less his definition of transformational resilience is not just to survive or endure massive stressors, which he was predicting would start to come one right after the other. No more long waiting times where we can recover ourselves and gather ourselves back up. And sure enough, in the last few years, we've had chain after chain of massive stressors around the world. So anyway, the definition of transformational resilience, if I can paraphrase it, is to not just endure or survive these possibly many large-scale stressors, but to possibly learn or grow and possibly even thrive in the midst of it, in the midst of any one of them, or in a chain. And I'm curious if that's familiar to you, and if from any direction, not just Bob Doppelt, and what that sparks you to share from your experience of that.
Yeah, one thing I would do, even if briefly, is I have to brag about my school, because we have public programs that are constantly putting on programs like that emphasize that. So at the California Institute of Integral Studies, that's cutting edge. And then there's voices that appear a lot there's a Facebook group that Linda Bazell runs that's just called Eco Psychology. It's got like 9,000 people in it now. And so sometimes you'll see links to the work of Charles Eisenstein and other voices who are saying the same thing, basically, that we need a new story about how we're going to move forward, not just tough it out, the old hyper-masculine model, and the hyper-individualistic model, but how can we be together in this in a way that makes community flourish instead of fall apart? So that's work that's being done. Let's see, who else? I mean, some of what I'm going to present over this next year focuses on some of that and gives examples of it too. There was one, there's been a habit a fruitful one, I think, in the world of Jungian psychology to look for wisdom in folk tales and fairy tales from different parts of the world, even what in the West we call myths. Other parts of the world call them traditional stories or sacred stories. But there's one I'm going to be talking about a little bit in my thing on April 15th, and it's from one of the Grimm's stories. It's a piece of folklore called The Devil's Sooty Brother. And have you heard that story?
I have not.
I won't tell it here, but one of the images that I love about this story is that there's a guy he's discharged from the army, so he's a soldier who's broke, an ex-soldier who's broke. No one's looking out for him. They were like, "Thanks for your service, bye." Right. And the devil comes to him with an offer. So the whole story is about how he creatively adapts to being approached not only by the devil himself, but by an unscrupulous innkeeper and a number of other people, and how he deals with it. And one of the images that comes to mind from it is when he's in hell working for the devil for 7 years, he learns to play music. And they never tell you what instrument it is, so everybody's free to kind of imagine what it is. I always imagine like a recorder or something, but it's different for everybody. Mm-hmm. But he brings that to the surface and then plays music for other people. But learning to play music in hell seems like a useful metaphor for the kinds of things that we're going to have to learn how to do.
Would you say the name of that story again?
Yeah, The Devil's Sooty, Sooty, brother. And it's online, so you can look it up pretty easy. The other thing too is I look to the examples of communities that have been hammered by colonialism and oppression, and who are now widely sharing the practices that have held them together and actually made them flourish. So, people setting up committees of joy in beleaguered communities that are dealing with political oppression and warfare, having the audacity to set up groups that are dedicated to well-being and storytelling and human flourishing, things like that. There's examples all over the world. So we're going to need all that information as we move forward into this mess that we've created for ourselves.
I'm curious if there are any other websites or organizations that you're aware of that I could include in the or books for that matter, that start to gather up some of these resources, some of the threads that you were just talking about. And if you could advise us toward, looking up some of that stuff?
I would have a look at the eco-psychology group, because so much of that is collected there. The work of Wanjira Maathai, the daughter of Wangari Maathai, I forget how to spell her name exactly, but anyway, if you looked up either one of them, they would come up. The work that she's doing in the world, to some extent, the work Vandana Shiva is doing in the world. Charles Eisenstein, I mentioned earlier. There are people who Joanna Macy has mentored who are picking up her work and moving it forward and adapting it for the time that we now face. When Joanna first started working, there was some chance that we could turn this whole thing around, and now it's looking unlikely, increasingly unlikely, actually. So what's the next step? And so people like Molly Young Brown that she's interviewing. There's a Canadian eco-psychology network that routinely does interviews with thought leaders in this and other areas. So there's somebody I would look in on too. They do the interview through Zoom, and then they publish it online. That's a really great resource. So
I'm sorry, Native American.
Oh, the Canadian Eco-Psychology Network.
That's the group that you were just mentioning.
Also, a lot of good visioning and practical know-how came out of the Standing Rock situation, which is still going on. The Native American elders there are continuing to resist. So there's things coming out of that, not just in terms of protest, but also visioning. Oh, one other I should mention is the
Yeah.
Good Grief Network.
I'm sorry.
The Good Grief Network.
Good Grief Network. I know them well.
Yeah, they're a great resource.
One question I like to ask folks like yourselves, like yourself, that clearly have something to say, clearly have a historical context and a deep framing, experience-based framing for what's going on. And I'm curious, if you just had the last few minutes here, and if we could imagine a far larger venue, maybe maybe CNN came to its senses and had us on there to speak to the world instead of my little audience. If you had some sharing that you could do from your experience for folks for whom this is a relatively new conversation. They know that the world's in trouble. They know that much, and they've had their eyes kind of rudely jammed open to see what's going on and to start feeling what's going on. Can you share anything that might help those folks bridge to that fuller experience that they're walking into in a good way? Is there anything that you could offer to ease that bridging experience for them?
What I would recommend doing is, and some of this comes from eco grief work with people who are just starting what Linda Bazell and Sarah Edwards call the waking up syndrome, where you suddenly realize, sometimes with a shock, that things are really the way they are. And then what do you do with all the feelings that come up and the panic and everything else? So when people are in that stage, the first thing is to get support, because there's something to be said for individual practices of various kinds, mindfulness practices, somatic practices, and that all helps. But they were created for a time that wasn't facing the end of life, basically, on Earth. So this is a new situation for our species, even though we've been through tough times before. So we need support. We can't do this alone. So to seek out like-minded people who also get the same information and really understand what's happening is absolutely necessary. And what I've seen is that, even when people start out in panic or helplessness or rage, if they have other people who are supportive to talk to about it, they move through that pretty quickly. And they finally land at the question that's all important is, now what? So the second thing I would recommend is get busy. It's the age-old crisis advice, right? If you're freaking out, do something. Find something to do. It's not really the time to sit with it and ruminate and all that, right? If your house is burning down, you don't need to call your therapist. You need to put the fire out. There's this irritating term that's been going around for a while, eco-anxiety. And I keep telling people it's not anxiety anything. It's fear. It's rational fear, I mean, if an asteroid were headed toward our planet, nobody would create the word astro anxiety and look for a way to cure it. It's ridiculous, We'd get busy. So that's the second thing, is get busy with people who are involved in the cause that speaks to you. Because there's often one thing that stands out. For some people, it's food justice and animal welfare. For somebody else, it's climate change. It hits us in different ways. So I would recommend listening to how the world lands on your heart, and then seek out people that are doing something about it and join efforts with them.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I would say is, to get through this, we have to recover our ability to dream together, to imagine together in as diverse groups as we possibly can. So everybody together, different backgrounds, different cultures even, everybody together using their imagination to dream our way forward. Because if we can't imagine it, we can't make it happen. But if we imagine together, miracles happen. So we need to recover that ability.
Yeah. Really nicely done. Wow. That was very well done. Yeah, Craig, it's just an absolute pleasure to finally have met you, and to especially at this remarkable time in all of human history, but particularly in all of our collective lives, who all of us with the privilege and the miracle of being alive at this time. It's no surprise to me that you've been able to share item after item from your own history or what you're engaged with now that so addresses each one of the things you've shared have addressed some facet, some important facet of what we're all going through right now. So I appreciate very much the work and the focus that you've had for your entire life. And I I don't know how appropriate this is, but I put out a, a rousing thank you to you and your allies that you've been gathering over these years, and the important work for this dimension of our predicament. Just thank you for all that you've been doing for so long out on the margins.
I appreciate that, and thank you as well for your work in the world.
Yeah, it is also a pleasure for me, and a pleasure of proportion that I never thought I would see, but thank you.
That's one of the great things about this time, is as chaotic as it is and depressing and other things, there's still these opportunities for joy.
Yeah.
And they're abundant. They're not scarce. So
yeah. Well, I hope against hope that this is not our last time of talking with one another, because in something you just mentioned made me remember I've been collecting my own kind of elements. As you were talking about the enchantivism, I've been collecting the work of a number of different groups around the world that I would call them advanced practices in terms of people who might have gone through the work that reconnects, or some basic level of coming together and reconnection. And I would love to at some point have the next level of conversation with you about those kind of advanced practices that I've had my experience with and been gathering, and I have no doubt that you have your own collection that you've been either generating or connected with for some time. So perhaps that's next time.
oh, that'd be great. Yeah, that sounds
All
good.
right. Well, Craig, again, thank you, and take good care of yourself.
You too. Take care.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our now weekly support gatherings online that we call Safe Circle